The most famous betrayal in history was sealed with a kiss, and that's just the beginning of a night that would change everything. Let me tell you why this story from 2,000 years ago still captivates people today.
You know what fascinates me most about this narrative? How it captures such raw human behavior under extreme pressure. The political manipulation, the mob psychology, the personal betrayals. It's all there.
Well, that's exactly right. And what's really interesting is how this unfolds in stages. First, you've got this dramatic arrest scene in Gethsemane. Jesus has just finished this intense prayer session, and suddenly, boom, here comes this armed crowd led by one of his own followers.
Hmm. And the kiss is a signal. That detail is just devastating in its symbolism, isn't it? Using an intimate gesture of friendship to identify someone for arrest.
Oh man. And then things get wild. One of the disciples actually pulls out a sword and cuts off somebody's ear. But here's what's fascinating: Jesus, even in this chaotic moment, stops to heal the injured man. Like, who does that during their own arrest?
That response really highlights the contrast between human reaction and divine purpose. So, what happens next in this sequence of events?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting from a legal perspective. They drag Jesus through this series of completely illegal trials. And when I say illegal, I mean they're breaking their own religious laws left and right. These trials are happening at night, which was forbidden. They're not allowing proper defense, and they're actively seeking false testimony.
You know what's particularly striking about that? The historical context suggests that the Sanhedrin had strict rules about capital cases. They were supposed to wait at least 24 hours before passing a death sentence.
Exactly. And then there's Pilate. Uh, Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place. Historical records show he had already had several run ins with the Jewish leadership, and another uprising could have cost him his position with Rome.
The political dynamics are fascinating. The religious leaders had to carefully reframe their charges when they brought Jesus to Pilate. They couldn't just say blasphemy because that wouldn't matter to Rome.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. They switch the charge to sedition, claiming Jesus is setting himself up as a king in opposition to Caesar. It's like watching ancient spin doctors at work.
Well, speaking of spin, let's talk about that crowd manipulation. How does a crowd go from welcoming someone as a hero to calling for their execution in just a few days?
You know, social psychologists have studied this kind of crowd behavior, and it's fascinating. There's this concept called de-individuation, where people in crowds start to lose their sense of individual moral responsibility. Add in some strategic rabble-rousing from the religious leaders, and you've got a recipe for mob violence.
That's chilling. Oh, and so relevant to understanding mass movements even today.
And then you've got these incredibly personal stories playing out against this backdrop. Peter's denial is particularly poignant. Here's a guy who just hours before had sworn he'd die with Jesus. And now he's saying, I don't even know the man.
The psychological weight of that moment when the rooster crows, it must have been overwhelming.
And what's really fascinating is comparing Peter's response to Judas's. Both betray Jesus, both feel intense remorse, but they handle it completely differently. Peter's story becomes one of redemption, while Judas, well, he chooses a much darker path.
That contrast really highlights something universal about human nature, doesn't it? How we handle our failures and regrets can define us more than the failures themselves.
Absolutely fascinating point. And through all of this chaos and betrayal, Jesus maintains this remarkable composure. Even during the mockery and beating, he's not playing the victim. He's purposefully fulfilling a mission.
That sense of divine purpose running through human chaos really is the thread that ties this whole narrative together.
You know what's particularly relevant for today? How this story challenges us to think about our own responses to truth and justice. When do we speak up? When do we stay silent? When do we stand firm? And when do we compromise?
Those questions feel especially pointed in our current political and social climate.
And that's why this narrative continues to resonate so powerfully. It's not just ancient history. It's a mirror showing us something about human nature, about power, about courage and cowardice, about failure and redemption. These themes are as relevant now as they were 2 millennia ago.
Looking toward the future, how do you think this story will continue to shape people's understanding of justice and redemption?
Well, I think as long as humans grapple with questions of loyalty, truth, and moral courage, this narrative will offer insights. It shows us both the depths of human failure and the heights of divine purpose. And most importantly, it reminds us that even our darkest moments don't have to be the end of our story.